Hey parents, Dr. Eric here from Adio Chiropractic. I want to first of all just thank you so much for joining me today as I'm going to talk about a topic that is impacting so many kids and is probably one of the top three reasons that we see that we have parents bringing in their kids, and that is ear infections. Now, we understand, and I understand how hard it is to see your child struggle with ear infection after ear infection after ear infection, and to have those continued pediatrician visits, the multiple antibiotic use, the risk of potentially hearing loss or speech delays, to caring for your little one with high fevers and the sleepless nights, because the sleepless nights for them, but also the sleepless nights for you as parents too. And as a parent myself, just seeing that your child not feeling well, it really eats away at you. Not just when it happens once, but especially when it happens over and over and over. And I get it. You get that feeling of loss, or that you're just not doing enough for your kid. And what I want you to know is that you are doing enough. It's with what you know onto that. It isn't that you are neglecting your kid or anything like that. It's just that, what you know so far can only take you so far. And that's what I want to do today, is expand that knowledge about what's going on with ear infections and get down to that root cause and explain why ear infections are really happening, so that we can take that information, and then how can we as parents help our kids even more to kick this cycle of this recurrent ear infection epidemic, and how can we allow our kids to express life to the fullest, onto that. That's what we're going to talk about today. That's what I want to provide for you, is answers and hope for you and for your family and for your little kiddo that is struggling over and over and over onto that. So what I want to talk about is that, so let's get into ear infections. Let's first just talk about this thing of common versus normal. I have so many parents that, and I don't blame them. It's what they're told. It's what they're perceiving. But I have so many parents that say, well, my kid deals with recurrent ear infections, and I know that it's normal, but it's just I don't want to see my kid going through that. Well, first let's undertake this common versus normal. Now, there is a huge difference between common and normal. Just because something is common doesn't make it normal. So when we look at this, 80% of children will have at least one ear infection by the time that they're 3 years old. 80%. By that statistic, you would think that ear infections are a normal process, but I want you to know, parents, the struggle of watching your kid with recurrent ear infections, or just ear infection, one ear infection or so, is not a normal thing. The sleepless nights, the struggle of watching your kid in discomfort is not a normal thing. Yes, it's common, but it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be months of struggle, and pediatrician visits and calling in to work sick because your kid is sick again. It doesn't have to be that way. Ear infections account for about 30 million visits to the pediatrician each year, and the most common reason that kids actually visit their pediatrician onto it. But it doesn't have to be that way, parents. There is things out there that can help to kick this cycle of ear infection after ear infection onto that. So when we look at that, most kids experience not just one ear infection, but seven, eight, nine. I've had kids in the double digits. Some get close to the triple digits of ear infections without relief onto that. And then, we get antibiotics, we get tubes, and the thing is they're still getting them, or maybe they stopped for a while, but then they started coming back again. And that's because something isn't working. We're just addressing the the top layer with them when it comes to ear infections. What I'm going to talk about today is getting down to that deeper layer of what's actually happening with them so that we can make a bigger impact in those ear infections and in our kids' overall health. So let's just talk very shortly on the two types of ear infections. We get otitis media, which is your middle ear infection, and that is by far the most common ear infection that is out there. Then we have the otitis externa, or what most people refer to as swimmer's ear, onto that. Now, when we look at ear infections, just like 80% of children experience, 80% of ear infections are viral in nature. What do I mean by that? Meaning that 80% of all ear infections that occur are created because of a virus and not because of bacteria. So when we look at that, that meaning that when we look at what we're using to address an ear infection, are we truly benefiting it? Is there more of a benefit versus a risk? And when we look at it, because the number one thing prescribed to kids when they come into a pediatrician for ear infection is an antibiotic. But if 80% of ear infections are viral in nature, that antibiotic isn't doing anything for them. And why? Because antibiotics are, addressing a bacterial infection. So that's why, pediatricians should be doing cultures to find out if it actually is viral or bacterial if they're looking at prescribing antibiotic, because that antibiotic can create lifetime digestive issues, poor gut health, decreased immunity, all of these longer term issues, especially if it's repetitive use. Now, don't get me wrong, if we need the antibiotic, like, that's what they're there for. So I'm not against antibiotics. They have their time and place onto it. So, but let's talk about the most common signs of ear infections. So what we see is, one is teething. And with teething, that brings excess fluid to the ears, to the nose, to the throat area. Another one is congestion. When we get congested, when we're not draining like we should be, we have this drainage system in our body, and when it's not working to its best, things start becoming backed up and we get congested. Another sign is fever. We get these high and low valley fevers, or we may even get this low grade consistent fever where it's not truly spiking, but they definitely have a fever that's just low grade onto that. Another thing that you may see is you get the pulling and tugging of the ears, right? Because what happens is we get irritation in that area that causes children to pull or tug at the earlobe onto it. But sometimes that can get mixed up too with a kid that's just teething, because sometimes kids will go like this, and they'll kind of like tug initially at the ear, but then they go down along the chin line, and that can be a sign maybe just of teething instead of just an ear infection. So, to not get that mixed up also. But when we look at it, there's this sequence of ear infections for kids. And what happens is, first we get this fluid in the ears. And this can be with teething, congestion, plus poor drainage challenges. The ear is overwhelmed with fluid that isn't draining properly, and it becomes susceptible to ear infections. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on that, how that can happen, because this is an important part of where chiropractic can, that I'll address a little bit later. But a lot of times when we look at ear infections, we look at it as, well, it's an infection, so there's bacteria or viruses. But what created the bacteria or virus to come there in the first place? It isn't that they were just they had a ton more bacteria and viruses surrounding them. There's something that created an environment susceptible more to bacteria and virus infection. So what that really is we have to look at the anatomy and the function of the ears and the drainage. So when we look at this, we have the ear, and then we have this tube that drains the ear down into the throat. Now that tube is called the eustachian tube. Now there is a muscle that surrounds that tube, and it allows the ears to drain into the throat. Now that muscle, gravity doesn't play any factor in the drainage. The muscle actually helps to kind of milk that fluid slowly down so that the body doesn't get overwhelmed. Now what can happen is with overwhelm, with stress, particularly on the nervous system, or if we have stress particularly in that top part of the neck, what that does is that muscle that surrounds that tube gets its function and gets its nerve supply from that top part of the neck. So if there's stress there, irritation, what that can do is that can create that muscle to contract. And now if that muscle contracts on that tube, we don't get drainage. We have poor drainage of that ear. And if we don't have drainage, fluid gets backed up. And if fluid gets backed up, it becomes stagnant. So when we look at that world, what's attracted to stagnant water? Bacteria and viruses. So they come in and now they create an ear infection, but then the antibiotic in the tube is addressing the infection. But what created the infection in the first place? But to continue on with the sequence of ear infections, we get the fluid in the ears, but then, after antibiotic after antibiotic, at some point, ear tubes are recommended. So what happens is ear tubes cause the fluid that's in the ear to drain from the ear down into the throat. Ear tubes do not allow the fluid from the ear to drain outside of the ear. It takes that fluid that's in that ear, and with the tube, what it does is that